It was really fun to see the red thread of the three presentations, I think. Tiffany did a good job in the structuring of the program.
Yeah, it was neat to see the evolution, right, in terms of just sort of the transformation in downstream into your case study, and then sort of how we, looking sort of back at how we operationalize things.
Mm-hmm. And Amy really wowed me when she said that thing about World War II. I hadn't heard that statistic or fact before, that this was sort of the most innovative time since that last time period. That was really interesting.
I think it was actually Beth.
Did you say that, Beth?
I did.
Well, maybe Tiffany said it. Tiffany said it at the beginning.
Amy had other quotes that I thought were equally interesting. I was sort of noting them as I was going along. But yeah, no, that was right. The Great Depression, and really the change on the food and how people access their food.
Yeah.
Thank you for your patience. For some reason, it would not unmute me, even though it looked like it was unmuted. So, and thank you again for your great presentations. I think, queuing off that you were just talking about the quote from the Great Depression, I think one of the first questions I have for you as a panel is, if crisis creates the conditions for forming new habits, how do we ensure that these innovative approaches stick within the life sciences industry? Because I think, it's such an entrenched industry in the way it operates because of the heavy regulation, that it's easy to slip back into the way things used to be.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would say that I think it goes back to, obviously we're all working in the life sciences world, and we're all built on innovation. It's just, a lot of it's been very entrenched in the science, and it's, it's going to continue just to be there. But again, it's about marrying the science with the human being, and that is what is going to be a requirement in the future. Because again, looking at that rising consumerism of healthcare, we can't go back. Pandora's box has been opened. There's an expectation, if more of the burden for the having to pay, having to coordinate is going to fall on the end user, or the individual person, there's going to be an expectation there, and they're going to have choice, and they're going to have we're seeing the rise in greater options and more flexibility. So I don't think we can go backward. The question becomes, are we going to rise to the challenge and be able to think about solving these healthcare problems in a different way that's truly embedded in the core problem for the end user? And are we going to move forward to find solutions that meet them? That's going to require an openness to partnership and co-collaboration. I think we're realizing that we cannot do it alone, which was kind of the old model too, very much IP oriented, and I own my own stuff and I don't share. Open innovation is going to be a key as well. But if we're going to have to keep that alive. Otherwise, you're going to end up just being a plug into somebody else's platform down the road. So that's my sort of point of view on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I think one of the key things is really investing in an agile operations mindset, and I think that requires a product first mentality. So everything we put out there has to have legs to be scaled, and a mechanism in place that's flexible to adjust to changes in technology. So to me, that also thinks potentially, could there be a chief technology officer, a chief product officer, like experience officer? How do we think about how that sort of translates itself operationally? Because I think that's going to be a critical piece of making sure that we can make digital transformation happen in companies.
Mm-hmm.
Jess, any thoughts before we move on?
No, I'm okay. I actually got distracted by a question for me in the chat panel.
Okay. Before I because I do want to get to that one, Robin was asking about lessons learned and best practices in change management, and I think that's a nice cue off what we're talking about with whether these will stick. Have you experienced any specific applications of trying to get the culture to change currently as we've navigated through this crisis? Especially Beth, with your work in trying to get accelerated patient communications, how did you socialize it and convince them that this is what we had to do?
I think that it's less of a challenge during a pandemic and more of a challenge in normal times. Does that make sense? So
Mhm.
I felt like during a pandemic, everybody was aligned around we need to have a response, right? So to me, that was less of a challenge and like thinking, okay, now as we think forward, how do we make this model stick of fewer silos, more cross-functional collaboration, access to, the leadership at levels that were able to make things happen. I think that's more kind of where my head is at, because I feel like not to sort of, I think the work was challenging and we learned a lot from it, but I sort of think forward to think that potentially afforded almost a reason for us to do that. And with absent a reason, like a pandemic or a crisis, to your point, how do we continue to build that momentum? And I think, so that's, I think sort of pushing away the barriers and the silos is going to be critical to that. I also think, the fact that we have patient services, and I know obviously a lot of pharmas and life sciences, have something like patient services. The mission and the values of what patient services is about is really patient oriented. So I would, I hope, as we think forward, that patient service is able to operate from a similar place of, how do we get some of these innovative, transformative experiences out there, right? And how do we act as the catalyst for that change? Just because of the vantage point of where we sit.
And Amy, what
I
have you?
add on to that, Tiffany, that my background is in startups, so I've been doing emerging and growing companies for about a decade now, and I would say it always hurts before it feels better when you're building something new and innovative. It's always painful before it gets better, and so for the people that drive this change, when we talk about it, it's sticking and it really like staying in this industry, it's going to be hard, I think, because doing something even an even harder way or a longer way or a more manual way, or having to revisit the IRB protocol several times to get the amendment through that you want, that's going to take persistence, and that's going to take, someone's going to have to feel really motivated by that. And so the question that I don't think I have the answer to, is what will be that motivating factor? What will keep people and companies motivated on pursuing that change, on working through the pain to keep these innovative things in place, rather than saying, well, that was fine to spend that much money when it was COVID. It was fine to do it the long way when it was COVID, but now it's not, and we need to go back to the old way. I do think that the patient's voice is going to matter in this. So once patients have seen that there are other ways, they're going to have a harder time going back. And in the arena of life sciences that I particularly work in, I think if it means that the patient has a choice between participating in one study and another study, and one of them offers patient-centric approaches, ability to get assessments in a more convenient way, the things that I'm involved with, I could see that patient choosing the study that was more convenient for them. So maybe the patient voices will speak in that way. But I would actually pose a question maybe to Beth and Amy, what other motivations do you think would be there to work through the pain?
I think I totally agree with you on the pain point, because it is really hard. And I think when we looked at innovation outside of our industry, it's transformed, like digital technology has transformed experiences in just about every other industry, whether it's retail or travel and leisure or finances. It's completely changed. Healthcare is the last sort of frontier, because it is so difficult and it is so highly regulated, and there's very good reason why it's difficult to do. But again, you've got to kind of have the burning platform. And I think COVID was a first test. We've been talking about a lot of these innovative opportunities as it related to telehealth. You saw dabbling in that, but before COVID, nobody could really figure out how to make it work. And it was kind of a pain in the butt if you were the HCP. How am I going to factor that into my practice? How am I going to get reimbursed for it? And now, now it's been used, it's being adopted, and it's not going to go away. And I think at the end of the day, in order for us to continue to build on that, it's going to come down to the outcomes. It's going to come down to efficiencies with total cost of care. And it's going to come down to the patient, the convenience factor. Why should I have to go to a doctor's office when I can have a consult from my bedroom?
Mhm.
Or and if I'm sick, why should I be exposing myself to other people who might be healthy, or vice versa? So we're now seeing the rise of the smart home, not just for living everyday life, but home as hospital, home for aging in place. So this, again, I go back to this rise in consumerism impacting healthcare. That's going to really drive the burning platform at the end of the day. And if you can equate that to improved outcomes and reduce total cost of care, that's where, the shared value is going to hit all stakeholders.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think one thing, and not just COVID, right, but this past year, if we think about the civil unrest, right, and injustices, right, I think that it was more than COVID. COVID definitely was part of this past year, but I think as a company too, we sort of shifted to, we need to make this a priority when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We need, and so when we were talking about momentum and your question, Jess, about how we keep things moving and sort of what's the lasting sort of impact, I think that is something we can look at and say, obviously we don't want it to have to come from a place that it got to where it got to, and for that to stem. But I think it's a positive in terms of change and really highlighting where we need to focus, so that we're being patient. And so that I think the other thing too to consider, and this is something I think about a lot, is just access, right, to internet. And all these experiences we put out there assume patients are able to access the internet, right, and don't have challenges with their internet, and or maybe don't have internet at all. And so I think that inequity is something that's going to be important to continue to solve for, right, is how do we sort of bridge that gap, because I think that's going to make a big difference too.
Well, I think that's a great segue too into that question that was posed to you, Jess. But I'd love to hear everybody's take on it from Bistro regarding how where do you see the role of portable health services in rebuilding trust in the healthcare system among vulnerable communities and individuals?
This one, I'll tell you why I was distracted when I saw it, because 2020 Onsite before the pandemic had a nonprofit branch of the company where we went into the Boston public school systems, and we would provide eye exams, and through partnership with Warby Parker, free eyeglasses for children who otherwise probably wouldn't have gotten eye exams. Some really heart-wrenching stories coming out of that, of children seeing the blackboard for the first time, but so many learnings from that. That's my direct experience. So I'm just going to talk to my direct experience. But the learning from that is this concept of, in my backyard, my people in my backyard, in my community. I don't need to leave my comfort zone. I don't need to leave the people that I'm used to being around and go someplace else and feel uncomfortable or feel like I'm different to receive care. Care is coming to me. Other people that I know are receiving care, watching the children interact with each other, try on glasses with each other. There's a real sense of community in receiving the healthcare where they were. And so while that, that's a very specific example to a project, I think it blossoms into, as an NPR junkie, there's been a lot of things on here about bringing access to care and where they're putting COVID clinics and whether or not people are getting them. And the two stories that come to my mind are, one was in Los Angeles, they put a COVID clinic in an area they thought would serve an underserved population, and it didn't, because even though it was there, they wouldn't go into the clinic necessarily. And then there was a barber shop somewhere, if somebody knows, you can chime in, where he got set up to deliver COVID vaccine to his population, and the whole community is getting vaccinated in this barber shop. And to me, that just shows the value of the community relationships, the trust with the people around you, and bringing care to people where they are, rather than asking them to put themselves in a different or more uncomfortable situation.
And I think that's a really good example of when I, in my presentation, that 80%, it's the social determinants of health. All those things that impact your ability to engage in your health and wellness that sit outside of the traditional standard of care, the clinical biomarkers for if you're sick or healthy, and the traditional care. And understanding someone's access to transportation, their access to healthy food. Do they live in a safe environment? Do they live in a crime-riddled neighborhood? What is their social network? Those are all things that on its surface have nothing to do with taking medication or going to the doctor, but they have overwhelming influence on someone's ability to do that. And we have to I think the next phase is we have to really understand those considerations, how people live their life every day and the environments in which they live and what's influencing them socially and community-wise to move the needle. Going into a barber shop to get your vaccine was probably not something anybody thought of when, from the beginning of this. It was all about, well, the states are going to manage the distribution. Then it's gone to the more traditional pharmacies. But a lot of people don't trust pharmacies. They trust their barber. So it's understanding the person, who they are, the patient as a person and their world, and then meeting them where they are in a safe environment. And then that builds on itself because they share with their community.
Anything to add there, Beth?
No, I think Jess and Amy both said it eloquently. Nothing additional to add on that one.
Well, I think it raises an interesting question too, is, when you look at that 80%, Amy and panel, where does the pharma company fit into that, in that, you're really a treatment-based organization versus looking at that rest of the person? Is there an opportunity to play a direct role, a partnership role? How do you see the opportunity to influence?
I think that's a big question right now, because our traditional model is we develop pharmacotherapy or the services that are wrapped around that. And, to move the needle though, because when we look at the adherence rates, we look at the compliance rates, they're not really changing. They haven't forever, despite the fact that the medications and the interventions have gotten better and better and better and more expensive. Why is there this disproportionate sort of reflection of things are improving on one side, but the outcomes are not?
Mm-hmm.
And it's because I think that we're still, expecting the old model to work. If we build it, they will come. And I think that we have to really be thinking about, as we're solutioning, what is the true unmet need of the end user, and how do we meet that need? So it's gonna require us to think about. We've only looked at this in pharma. We've actually looked at less than 20%, because that 20% encapsulates the access to the clinic setting, and medication is only a piece of that. So we're probably less than 5%, technically speaking. So if we're going to move the needle, we have to look outside of that, and we have to determine, it's kind of the classic, where do we play, and do we have a right to play here? So what are the influencers that we can have an influence on in a positive way? It might not be everything. It might be some of it. It might be none of it. But I would argue that there's something there, that there's a huge opportunity. If you ask me, it's just you have to figure it out, and then it becomes, well, does this fit our current model as a pharmaceutical manufacturer? Do we need to adjust our model? Do we need to change? Do we need to spin out? It's all those things. But suffice it to say that healthcare of the future isn't going to be just based on what we have today. It's not going to be just about going in to see a doctor, a pharmaceutical toolbox to use. It's going to be different interventions. There's going to be a focus on wellness and prevention versus the sick care model. So what is your role as a pharmaceutical manufacturer in that? Because traditionally you're supporting a sick care model. So it's all these questions that we need to think about. And I think a lot of the secret lies in that understanding that 80% and knowing, where you have a role to play and where you don't.
Definitely.
I would agree with the swim lane kind of conversation. I think it's been a theme of, where do we show up? I mean, even within our own company, because a lot of folks are doing digital, right? So how do we show up in support of solutions that help our patients, right? And how what we're doing different, right, from other groups. I think, as we think of the future too, and this, probably in the next now and into the next couple of years, so not like 10 years down the road per se, but they're going to be more digital health partnerships, right? So less of relying on a pharmaceutical per se to have all those data integrations and answers, but more of those health partnership connections. And I think more the passive sort of seamless data integrations where patients are getting the access they need to what they, need in the moment. I also think if we think about kind of, potentially where pharma could play, when you think about the actual device application, whether that's the injectable, right, or infusions, how do we better tie device application to a companion app, right? Like those are the types of useful kind of technology solutions that I could, see down the road and, and what we should be doing.
I don't know how much I touched on this in my presentation. Sometimes you sort of black out during those things. But I think, we are doing a couple post-market access to care programs. And I think if I want to highlight one in particular, where it's a patient population with a chronic illness, so they're going repetitively to centers for treatment. And what Amy was saying, where you're thinking about what's that other 80%, how do we adopt? I mean, it's so easy to say, yes, you need to get a yearly eye exam as part of label adherence for this particular medication because there's a small chance that you will go blind, which would scare, I think, any of us. But if it's on top of going to your hematologist, going to your radiologist, going to your general practitioner, going to get infusions, getting injections, getting x-rays, MRIs, whatever it is that really worth it? Is the threshold for what makes it worth it to you really apparent? And you don't want to scare the patients. You don't want to deter them from taking the medicine. But you do want that label adherence, and you do want, even preventative care to happen. So I think the idea of what are the easy to remove from the systems pieces of healthcare that can be coupled with other pieces, right? We've got this Tetris game where everybody's separate and they're doing it. And you have to go to this building to get your labs and you have to go over here. What are the places that can be untethered or uncoupled from either physical locations or people? And can they be moved around so that you combine as much of the patient experience as can be in one area, in one place, in one clinic visit or in one home visit? And I think that that's just an approach that doesn't seem to be very prevalent right now, is like the deconstruction of that and then reconstruction of it for the patient's benefit versus the current healthcare system setup.
Yeah, I have to agree with that 100% because it's an easy button. Because, with all those sort of healthcare touch points that you called out, coming from, the health life sciences point of view, we're thinking about, okay, these are all the things that you have to do to maintain your health. If you have a chronic condition, let's say diabetes, my company works very much in the diabetes space, and there are some very traditional standards of care, clinical biomarkers related to blood sugar, and you need to check your blood sugars every day. You get your A1Cs once or twice a year, and it's all these boxes that you have to check, and that's how we're basing all of our planning, our interventions, when the reality is that's not happening. It's not happening. Like a person, the average person with diabetes is maybe getting an A1C once a year if they're lucky. It's one data point. It's not enough to make them change or motivate them to change. And then you're asking them to see a podiatrist, the ophthalmologist, the nutritionist, all these different things. And to your point, Jessica, they got to go here to get that, there to get that, and they got to schedule it. They have to reschedule it. It's miserable. It's a miserable experience, and it's just not happening. It is not happening. And in pharma, we keep thinking, we just assume that this is happening, but the data shows it's not, and yet we still keep going down this path of this is what you need to do, and your outcomes are going to be better, your quality of life is going to be better, but living day to day is not conducive to that. And we make it very difficult with the system, with uncoordinated care, the cost, and the complexities of all of it. And then you layer on health literacy challenges and cultural considerations, that fears and things like that. I mean, it's just a very complex system, and we need an easy button, and we don't have that yet. But I do think that the future, the promise of what technology and digital and data can do, at some point we're gonna get there, because that's the way things are moving.
Definitely. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the clinical trials a little bit more. And what you're able to speak to about where you're able to integrate more of a patient-centric approach in designing the trials. And I know, Jess, you have a really good story about this, about the change in the indication based on the research that was done with the patients for what the drug needed to treat. But I'd love to hear what you could share about different ways you're incorporating this human-centric approach. And then Leah had a question, has it helped patient enrollment as a result?
Is that one for me?
Oh, it's for all of you. But if you want to start with your story about the ophthalmology trial.
Yeah, you'll have to remind me, actually, Tiffany. I've told you a lot of stories.
It was the one where the endpoint for the study wasn't exactly what the patients wanted fixed, and I believe it had something to do with a certain type of blindness. Where they had done. It's not ringing a bell. Oh, well, I don't want to make up the story, but I think basically that when the trial was designed, that they had done some research directly with patients, and patients identified a different need for their condition. That whatever the endpoint of the trial was, that wasn't a critical factor in their quality of life. It was something else.
We have, I can say one of the things that we have been able to do because of the flexibility of the delivery model is to restructure the order in which patients have been tested. So for one of the studies in particular, we're doing, like I said, really long, painful studies, 6, 7, 8 hours, that in a more traditional environment would be very constrained, not because of lack of empathy on the caregiver or the healthcare worker, but because of the scheduling constraints of the clinic. So seeing other patients, bringing them through, needing the doctor or healthcare to see other patients in the normal clinic environment. And so one of the things that we've been able to do is to say, endpoints don't have to be collected back to back. If we're there for the whole day, we can come see you in the morning and we can come back in the afternoon. Or we actually discovered that there were 3 tests that we were doing and one was the most painful and we were leading with that one. There was no reason to be leading with that one. And it was sort of setting the tone for the rest of the visit for the patient, that they started with the most painful examination. And so we were able to stack the other ones, take a break, and then do the painful one at the end. So I think maybe that's the story I told you. I don't know, we've talked a lot, but just sort of listening to the patient outcome and being able to reconfigure the experience based on what they needed.
Excellent. Amy or Beth, are you able to speak to any of this at all? Or are you too far down the path from the clinical space at your organizations?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Tiffany, I'm too far down the path from clinical studies, definitely away from all that.
I mean, I'm not directly involved either, but there's I would just say that there's a lot of opportunity again to leverage the remote technologies and the AI and sophisticated sort of computational machine learning offerings that are out there to support remote site data gathering, using that to cull through data much quicker. So there's a lot of opportunity there as we look at leveraging those innovations in clinical trials, and again also supporting the ability to reach the more diverse populations. That's very important for us at Novo Nordisk as well. And COVID really pushed the acceleration of leveraging these new channels of working. And I think part of this is also going to be working a lot with the FDA and the regulatory bodies, because this is relatively new for them as well. And how are they going to be sifting through the data and approving these types of data collections?
Definitely. I apologize, but we were right at 3 o'clock. So thank you so much for your time and your thoughtful discussion. We really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for the questions and for staying with us.
Thanks, Tiffany. Thanks, Beth and Jessica.
Bye.
Yeah.